Dr. Stephanie L. Derrick is a Los Angeles-based screenwriter and an award-winning historian of religion in the modern era. She is especially interested in book history, the history of religious publishing in the 20th century Anglosphere, intellectual and print cultures in British and American Christianity, and, of course, C.S. Lewis. Dr. Derrick's current research is focused on women's contributions to the publishing history of the United States. She completed her PhD in history at the University of Stirling in Scotland and published The Fame of C.S. Lewis, a Controversialist Reception in Britain and America with Oxford University Press in 2018. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephanie Derrick?
Thank you so much, Colton. Thank you, everyone who put together this conference. This is amazing. I feel so honored to be the first keynote. Today, I am speaking on C.S. Lewis in America. I wrote about this subject in a book published in 2018, just mentioned. But since that time, the zeitgeist and my own interests have changed. So today I'm going to give you the highlights of a decade's worth of research into Lewis in America. Make sure that this goes. There you go. There's your outline for where we're going with this paper. So that's the first part of the talk. Then in the second part, I'm going to add on to that research, giving more attention to some elements that I think merit it. And then finally, I want to think together about biography and Lewis biographies, and biography as a form and what it can tell us about what's at stake when people write and talk about Lewis. But these days, just to kind of give you a heads up, I'm interested in the question of why people feel like there is something at stake and how Lewis, his life story is told, or anyone's life story is told. Not why they think it's important, but why do they feel it's important? What does it mean to get his story right? And why does it matter? So that's a little teaser. But I first became interested in Lewis's fame back in 2007 and began working on it then. So between all writers and their readers stand a host of factors shaping perceptions, expectations, and reception. In Lewis's case, these mediating factors resulted in strikingly different responses from British and American audiences. So in my research, I compared Lewis's reception in Britain and America as a way of illuminating both cultural contexts. I'll be focused on the American side in this talk, but I'll use that comparison where it's useful. Okay, so let's get started by getting a lay of the land from the widest possible angle. I want to briefly cover some of the basics of Lewis's life. Almost everybody in here will know those, but there might be some people in our audience who don't. And I'm going to put like a pop culture, tabloid, Entertainment Weekly, or People magazine spin on it. On the personal bits for reasons relevant to this talk. I do have a purpose in doing that. So Lewis was born in Belfast in 1898. Lost his mother when he was young and served in World War I, then moved to Oxford where he attended Oxford University. He then worked as a fellow at Oxford from 1925 to 1955, at which point he was made professor of Cambridge University. Lewis became involved with a married Irish woman who was separated from her husband named Jane Moore when he was 19 and she was 45. Jack and Jane lived together for 31 years until she moved into a nursing home in 1950. In 1956, Lewis married an American woman who had left her husband for him. Lewis lived with her and her two sons until her death in 1960, and then Lewis himself died in 1963. Lewis was a literary scholar who published 36 books in his lifetime in many different genres, from poetry to science fiction to children's books and literary criticism. The broad strokes of his fame are this. He is best known today for the Chronicles of Narnia series, especially The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Greta Gerwig, who co-wrote and directed the Barbie movie. Yay! Oh dear. Let's see. There we go. Greta Gerwig is writing a new script based on that book, so we can expect another round of interest in Lewis when that movie is released. This is just an AI-generated entertainment when you mix those two things. However, Lewis first became a household name as an apologist for Christianity in both the UK and US beginning in the 1940s. Y'all don't have to look at that forever. Let's see. Or maybe you do. Okay. In the States, Lewis was well known enough to appear on the cover of Time magazine in 1947. As one book after another of his hit American bookstores in the 40s and beyond, they were reviewed and discussed in a thriving print culture. Lewis was a mainstream author, but he was the special darling of bookish Christians of all stripes, of which there was plenty at that time. He was read by every kind of Christian, from fundamentalists to Catholics to Unitarians. After his death in 1963, his literary estate was managed by an American named Walter Hooper and Lewis's friend Owen Barfield, and then from 1980 onward by the C.S. Lewis Company. That company was very good at marketing Lewis, ensuring that his books and the many intellectual properties associated with his name remained familiar to the American public. Meanwhile, social changes played a key role. As universities and the secondary education system expanded in the second half of the 20th century, Lewis's books about Christianity were taken up by students, professors, ministers, and millions of regular readers who were interested in questions of faith. That was in addition to all the parents and teachers reading the Chronicles of Narnia series to kids. In 1996, the movie Shadowlands with Deborah Winger and Anthony Hopkins portrayed the story of Lewis and his American wife. Then in 2005, Disney came out with their Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe movie. So all of those circumstances, television, film, the growth of publishing, the expansion of education, created favorable conditions for Lewis to continue to be brought to the public's attention. His enduring fame, we could say, was tied to some of the great social changes of the 20th century. Because he wrote for popular audiences, wrote in many genres, and wrote so much, his fame benefited from these great democratizing changes. Lewis's books were both very well suited and perfectly timed to take advantage of changes in American culture. That's a bird's eye view of the big moments of Lewis's fame in America. Okay, so what is interesting to say about the texture or quality of Lewis's reception in America? What do you see when you get down into the weeds and look, as I have, at the countless reviews and blogs and references and articles and books about Lewis and letters to Lewis and testimonials and creative spin-offs and the many, many ways in which Americans have responded to Lewis? Well, that's where comparisons with the UK proved really useful. First of all, Lewis's effect on readers in both countries was remarkable and long-lasting, no matter how you measure it. I'm just taking that as a given. But one of the distinguishing characteristics about his American reception when compared to Britain is the relative absence of criticism. In the UK, there was always, right from the beginning, a strain of negative and even hostile responses to Lewis that really didn't present itself in America to a comparable degree. For another thing, in America, there was, right from the beginning, a level of intensity among Lewis fans that rarely showed up in the UK. Lewis's correspondence, for example, shows that probably hundreds of American fans wrote to him over the years. Many of these people were hoping to establish a personal connection with him. One Presbyterian pastor in New York wrote after Lewis's death, "I had always dreamed of meeting him, and I cannot tell you how much his passing has touched me with a certain loneliness, knowing that I shall never in this life see his face." Many Americans would have shared that sentiment. In Britain, there were also many people who had their lives changed by Lewis's books and were great admirers. But there wasn't an equivalent outpouring of adoration. Americans have tended to want to connect with Lewis's person in an intense way. So that begs the question, what was it about people in these two countries that made their reactions to Lewis different? That's the question that got me interested in this topic in the first place, and it's definitely a complicated situation. Some of the difference can be attributed to the fact that this defender of Christianity appeals to the more numerous Christians in America. Our population is much larger. Our country is one in which the faith has fared better compared to the UK since mid-century. Some of Lewis's appeal has to do with plain old Anglophilia. But it turns out that some of the reason has to do with the way that Lewis presented himself, his tone, his style of speaking, the posture he took towards his readers, and any subject that he chose to tackle. Not all, but some. Much of the criticism Lewis received from his British contemporaries revolved around a tendency he had of being dismissive of those who disagreed with him on pet issues, and also his adoption of the persona of a backwards-looking traditionalist with a hard-headed resistance to modernity. Over and over, in fact, friends, colleagues, and reviewers wrote about what they saw as a kind of forced persona that Lewis adopted of someone stuck in a former age. In fact, Lewis identified as a controversialist in the manner of G.K. Chesterton. He was known among the literati of Britain, particularly for championing an earthy, accessible, everyman approach to literature, as well as extolling the virtues of the past over modernity. This is the novelist Penelope Fitzgerald. She was a Booker Prize-winning novelist, and she was an undergraduate at Oxford in the pre-war years, and she attended Lewis's lectures on medieval and Renaissance literature. Her notes from one lecture read, C.S. Lewis says, "Forget courtly Spenser, dreamy Spenser. Think of rustic Spenser, English Spenser, homely Spenser, kindled lust, worldly muck, bagpipes, goat milking." Years later, she wrote, Lewis was the indispensable teacher, about whom all we personally knew was that he was pipe and beer loving, lived outside Oxford, and made a thing of disliking the 20th century. When T.S. Eliot came to read The Wasteland to the Poetry Society, Lewis was not there. For years, in fact, Lewis was critical of Eliot's poetry and criticism, and he developed a reputation for being disputatious. Whether he was decrying modern educational theories or challenging a Milton scholar on the place of authorial personality in poetry, or weighing in on debates about the English studies curriculum at Oxford, Lewis invariably made his opinion known with verve and sided with tradition over change. One student wrote, and I have a slew of quotes from students, so maybe you can follow on the slide there. So the first student, quote, "It must be remembered that Lewis always affected, I think that it was deliberate, to be a plain, honest man with no nonsense about him, usually wearing when out on a walk an old tweed hat and coat, and accompanied with a pipe, a stick, and a dog." Another student remembered Lewis saying to him, "Rook, you think of me as a medievalist and a scholar. You're making a mistake. I'm nothing of the sort. I'm a butcher, a rough and brutal man." Still another found it notable that Lewis habitually read the decidedly lowbrow Punch during the breakfast hour at Magdalen. Still another student wrote that Lewis, quote, "felt and even, I suspect, took a pride in being old-fashioned," while another said that his, quote, "dominating recollection of his tutor during the war years was of, quote, forced geniality, which, he thought, quote, had become an inseparable part of Lewis's public persona, and which gave one an impression of a more toughly masculine and aggressive character than perhaps he was." Lewis's friend, Lord David Cecil, provided a description that resembled these former pupils' collective portrait. Lewis, he said, had adopted the mask of an extrovert, lively, unintrospective, confident, combative personality, which he put on for his utterances in print or on platform. Furthermore, not too few British readers saw a connection between this persona and what they identified as a reactionary quality in Lewis's writings. This is Helen Gardner. She was a fellow at St. Hilda's. She connected Lewis's resolute cheerfulness and equanimity, too resolute perhaps to be wholly convincing, with an effort to control his overwhelming emotions. This, she thought, at times expressed in his work as, quote, an underlying violence of feeling that led him to an exaggeration and extravagance in the conduct of what is presented as a purely intellectual argument, while on other occasions it came through as, quote, an almost willful refusal to recognize what the work he is discussing is about, as distinct from what metaphysical ideas or moral attitudes it inculcates. A.L. Rouse, a historian and fellow at All Souls, Oxford, wrote that, quote, the rhetoric and the exaggeration Lewis got from his Welsh-Irish father became problematic when it, quote, carried over into the fields of literature, philosophy, or theology. Finally, in a piece called The Man Behind the Mask, C.S. Lewis, a Cambridge colleague wrote that Lewis's personal letters, published after his death, revealed a disparity between the private Lewis and the stylized version of himself that he presented in print. For one, he said, quote, extracts from his journal revealed that he had read very widely to the modern period and that his mental equipment was by no means that of the old Western man he chose to present. We'll look at just another couple of my favorite quotes about Lewis, and then I think they're pretty accurate descriptions, or maybe they're just my favorites. But F.W. Basin said, quote, what Lewis really is a shrewd pricker of contemporary intellectual bubbles, who likes to dress himself up, partly for the fun of it, and partly for polemical purposes, as an Edwardian moralist. Bang goes the fist in simulated fury at some post-Edwardian excess, and at the same moment, a great grin opens on the jolly Irish face. And then we've got John Wayne, who is a student of Lewis's and then a friend. He said, everyone who knew Lewis was aware of this strange dichotomy. The outer self, brisk, challenging, argumentative, full of an overwhelming physical energy and confidence, covered an inner self as tender and as well hidden as a crab's. One simply never got near him. So the big point here is that in the UK, some of the reason that Lewis received a more critical reception from a broad range of quarters had to do with this tendency of his to speak in the guise of the sure-seated old Western man. Americans have tended to be more comfortable with this aspect of Lewis. In the UK, there was less patience for the way Lewis looked back to address modern issues, and more people took issue with his general tone and presentation. And it's important to note that this difference also included Christians. So, 10 years ago, I explained this difference from a social historical perspective, and I think that conclusion still stands. But here was my conclusion. In the second half of the 20th century, much of British Christianity, including evangelicalism, measured itself against the standard of honest, active engagement with the complex issues facing Christian theology, their neighbors, and the world at large. Fundamentalism, that strain of religion defined by belligerence, anti-intellectualism, a distaste for biblical criticism, and an aversion to social action, has been weak in the UK since the Second World War, while it has continued to thrive in America. In 1967, the National Evangelical Anglican Congress marked a resurgence of evangelicalism in Britain. However, evangelicals in the UK voiced their intention in that important convention and afterwards of participating in ecumenical ventures and becoming key players in addressing the social ills of the nation. Christianity in Britain after the Second World War was marked by its interest in engagement, a posture that repudiated the sectarian tendencies of previous generations and the fundamentalist strains within American Christianity. Resisting change put Lewis at cross purposes with some key ways in which the mainstream of British Christianity, and especially its leadership, was responding to the dramatic social and theological developments of the 20th century. In America, meanwhile, Lewis remained an influential figure for millions, in large part because the theological lens through which many Americans viewed their world endured, and because religious perspectives came under increasing pressure. In fact, in America, Lewis has been most valued precisely where people with theologically informed perspectives have engaged secularizing spaces. For example, Lewis has been critically important for many Christian college students. I think we're all familiar with this phenomenon. As I say, I think all that still stands. America has had more fundamentalists and has in general been more comfortable with a more strident and a more militant Christianity than British Christians were. And that's one reason that Lewis has been more passionately endorsed in the States and why there hasn't been the same degree of criticism here as there has always been in the UK. But now we're going to come to the second section of the lecture where I want to add to that, because actually now I think I didn't emphasize one important aspect of why Americans were more comfortable with Lewis's tone and self-presentation. The explanation I just gave gives pride of place really to intellectual and theological considerations. I was trained by David Bebbington, George Marsden, David Hempton, Mark Knoll. These men were they wrote social histories of Christianity, groundbreaking seminal histories that prioritized the life of the mind, theological convictions, and the ways in which Christianity evolved with cultural changes. But I don't think that foundation, excellent as it was, prepared me to give proper attention to the role that Lewis's masculinity has played in his reception. Looking at it now, I think American ideals of masculinity played actually a very important part in Americans' favorable reception of Lewis. And several things have brought this to the fore for me in the last 10 years. First of all, there's been a seismic shift in society in the way that we discuss and understand gender roles and sexuality. You can just watch rom-coms from even 15 years ago, and you'll see that sensibilities have changed. We're tuned in, I think, to these matters in a way that most of us simply weren't before. Secondly, misogynist Donald Trump, with the history of sexual assault to boot, still has the support of much of America, and that has changed how I think about misogyny and masculinity in America. It's made me take a closer look at that aspect of our society when I can stomach it. Thirdly, more historians are paying attention to how essential gender and sexuality have always been to American Christian identity. One of these historians, Kristen Dumais, author of Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. Got a shout out. It's a really good book. Dumais is a professor at Calvin University, and she's helped me think through how Lewis's reception has been impacted by American ideals of masculinity. She points out that, quote, white evangelicals are significantly more authoritarian than other religious groups and express confidence in their religious leaders at much higher rates than do members of other faiths. And she writes, quote, white evangelicals have pieced together a patchwork of issues, but that a nostalgic commitment to rugged, aggressive, militant white masculinity has served as the thread binding them together into a coherent whole. I'm going to steal a lot from her because I think it's really worth kind of the time. I just think it's really good, and it's informed my thoughts on this. But she wrote, it was in the 1940s and 50s that a potent mix of patriarchal gender traditionalism, militarism, and Christian nationalism coalesced to form the basis of a revitalized evangelical identity. With Billy Graham at the vanguard, evangelicals believed that they had a special role to play in keeping America Christian, American families strong, and the nation secure. The assertion of masculine power would accomplish all these goals. The reassertion of white patriarchy was central to the new family values politics, and by the end of the 70s, the defense of patriarchal power had emerged as an evangelical distinctive. The evangelical consumer marketplace was by then a force to be reckoned with, but this expansive media network functioned less as a traditional soul-saving enterprise and more as a means by which evangelicals created and maintained their own identity, an identity rooted in family values and infused with a sense of cultural embattlement. Christian publishing, radio, and television taught evangelicals how to raise children, how to have sex, and whom to fear. And Christian media promoted a distinctive vision of evangelical masculinity. Finding comfort and courage in symbols of a mythical past, evangelicals looked to a rugged, heroic masculinity embodied by cowboys, soldiers, and warriors to point the way forward. For decades to come, militant masculinity and a sweet, submissive femininity would remain entrenched in the evangelical imagination, shaping conceptions of what was good and true. By the 1980s, evangelicals were able to mobilize so effectively as a partisan political force because they already had participated in a shared cultural identity. So I think this rings true. And Dumais has certainly made a convincing argument in her book. I recommend it. Lewis was certainly part of the shared cultural identity that Dumais is referring to. So let's map this onto his reception. Dumais was talking about evangelicals. As Mark Knoll has pointed out recently, American evangelicals were slow to warm to Lewis, but any misgivings about his theology, smoking, or drinking largely gave way to canonization. By the 80s, evangelicals were some of the loudest fans in the sense that they wrote most frequently about him and in some of the most influential Christian outlets such as Christianity Today. Evangelicals' growing adoption of Lewis as a patron saint happened in conjunction with this rising pan-evangelical popular culture, one that Dumais points out was deeply committed to an aggressive, nostalgic, hero-oriented masculinity. Lewis checked many of the right boxes, didn't he? He was a war hero, a traditionalist, certainly traditionally masculine in a superficial sense, heterosexual, on the side of the everyman, backwards looking, someone with no time for pretension, an extoller of common sense, combative, impatient with modernity, resistant to change, someone with a reputation for being argumentative, even bullheaded. Lewis portrayed himself as embattled, and that portraiture was often taken up and reinforced by media outlets, both Christian and secular. So I think in the most superficial sense, we can see that Lewis did square nicely with American ideals of militant masculinity and that these played a role in his appeal. He was also, I'd be remiss not to add, sexist. Some of you might want to quibble with me on that, Jason. Yes. But I don't want to spend too long on this, so I'll give you a little bit of evidence, then move on to my real point in bringing it up. In the first place, not a few of Lewis's contemporaries pointed out his sexism. None other than his good friend Owen Barfield said in a meeting of the New York C.S. Lewis Society that Lewis could properly be called a misogynist on at least the theoretical level, though decidedly not so in his personal relations with individual women. Then there was Herbert Palmer, who wrote to Ruth Pitter in 1946, so this is well after his conversion. He said, quote, "I spent last Friday evening with C.S. Lewis. He is a convivial Irishman and looks like a cross between a jolly priest and a publican, with a dash of the fox-hunting squire thrown in. We had a great time and read our poems to one another until midnight. Actually, I discovered him first, for if you turn to my post-Victorian poetry, you will read a note on a long allegorical poem called Dimer by one Clive Hamilton. I did not know till a few days ago that Clive Hamilton was C.S. Lewis. He does not like women, but says he would like to meet you. He says all the women he knows are saints or devils, chiefly devils, and that he knows no betwixt and betweens. I imagine that he would include you among the saints, for he couldn't possibly put you with the devil class, and you are not average or mediocre." I could give you examples from things Lewis himself wrote, but let's move on. Militant masculinity and sexism, I would say, are correlated. So while I can't prove to you that Lewis's sexism contributed to his appeal in the States, at least without a lot more work that I'm definitely not going to do, I'm sure that it has in some quarters. To the extent that it was known, I think it bolstered his image as an alpha male. Maybe some of you will want to point to this writing or that writing to counter such a label. Maybe you'll think all this is a bit crude. But remember, what I'm talking about is the emotion that Lewis inspired in Americans, especially white, bookish Christians on a gut level, about how the way he looked, how he spoke, where he lived, his attitude to women, his attitude to changes in culture, how all that made Americans feel in a matter of seconds. I'm referring to snap judgments, to passions, to sentiment. This is the Entertainment Weekly edition. This is about the feeling that seeing Lewis's books on a church book table inspired based on what a youth pastor said about him around a dinner table the night before. It's all pretty amorphous, but that doesn't mean it isn't powerful. Okay, so now, what didn't square neatly onto most American Christian sensibilities? That was what became known about Lewis's sex life. So let's get all kinds of spicy. He toyed with sadomasochism in his youth, then had, as already mentioned, a relationship with a woman who was separated from her husband and old enough to be his mother, whom he lived with for 31 years. His relationship with his wife, Joy, was also less than neat and tidy, given that Lewis refers to himself as married in letters that predate their ecclesiastical marriage ceremony and other circumstances I'll discuss momentarily. Mind you, for me, personally, all this says about Lewis is that he was a normal human being with a messy human life. That's all it means to me. But for people who needed Lewis's personal life to check certain boxes, there were stories here that needed handling and managing. After all, there were valuable commercial properties tied to Lewis's good name. No one was more determined and in a better position to hide or spin aspects of Lewis's personal life that might damage his reputation than Walter Hooper, an American who Lewis met near the end of the latter's life, and then devoted the rest of his to preserving and promoting Lewis's literary estate and image. Hooper put Lewis squarely in the saint box. More than that, he and Chad Walsh, another American and the first to write a biography of Lewis, butted heads on whether Lewis had had sex with his wife or not. Hooper believed they hadn't. Very weird that this was even a conversation. But nevertheless, it was being had, and it was being had by people who were helping to shape Lewis's public image, writing biographies, annotating and publishing his letters, discussing his life anywhere and everywhere. As managers of Lewis's estate before his stepsons took the reins, Hooper and Owen Barfield did suppress information, at least for a time. The likelihood of there having been a sexual aspect to Lewis's relationship with Jane Moore is a part of Lewis's life that Hooper acknowledged in an introduction he wrote to Lewis's diary, published in 1991. In 1975, however, at Owen Barfield's suggestion, a 10-year seal restricting scholars' access to 11 volumes of Lewis family papers was put in place in order to delay people becoming aware of their relationship. Hooper, who was writing a biography of Lewis with Roger Leslie Green at the time, wrote to a friend, quote, "The Lewis papers contain much that makes it sound as though Mrs. M. and were L's mistress. Knowing that people would soon be reading the Lewis papers, we didn't know they would be put under seal. We thought future scholars would charge us with withholding evidence unless we at least acted as though we thought there could have been something between Mrs. M. and L." In other words, Hooper and Barfield, finding evidence that Lewis's relationship with Moore had likely been sexual, decided that it was best not to acknowledge or to deny as much. The claim of ignorance over the seal was untrue. They were the ones that put the seal on it. Clearly, then, details about Lewis's personal life were considered a liability to his platform with conservative American readers and were handled accordingly. Such beliefs about Lewis's personal life spilled out onto the public when British biographers and writers reacted to perceived hagiography and puritanical strains in the States. For example, both Humphrey Carpenter's group biography of the Inklings in 1978 and A.N. Wilson's biography of Lewis, published in 1990, were written expressly in reaction to the perceived hagiography across the Atlantic. Carpenter wrote, "Every biography I write is an argument against an existing viewpoint. With C.S. Lewis and the Inklings, I was trying to desanctify this man who had been made by a number of people into a latter-day saint, and trying to show the feet of clay, though at the same time admiring many aspects." Similarly, Wilson opened and closed his biography with an assessment of Lewis's legacy, especially the fervor with which devotees defended their own imaginings of Lewis. As he said, quote, "A writer who can evoke such reactions is worthy of scrutiny, and scrutiny of a particular kind." Both of these men were making an effort to overcome Lewis's image in America as a disembodied, idealized person. And to do so, both chose to shine a light on Lewis's interior world, presenting the man as a flawed, historically situated person. Carpenter considered Lewis in the context of his peers and the culture of Oxbridge from the 20s through the 60s. Wilson focused more on Lewis's psychological development from childhood and his relationships with women, asking how these influenced his religious and creative lives. Both are portraits of a complex personality whose life was full of ambiguities and contradictions, faith and doubt. Crucially, in both studies, Lewis appeared to the reader as someone firmly associated with a specific historical moment, a past moment. I remember doing research at the Wade Center at Wheaton in Illinois, and one of the directors spoke despairingly of Wilson, who it was felt had used their collection and then been irresponsible and rash with his portrait of Lewis. Whatever you make of Wilson's work, I got the sense that the offense was taken personally in Illinois. But then you could say that Wilson took umbrage with Americans' portraits of Lewis. Carpenter and Wilson weren't the only British writers to reach for the language and tools of psychoanalysis to understand Lewis. Before the Inklings, Christian journalist Malcolm Muggeridge suggested that a flaw, Muggeridge is on, he's sitting down, suggested that a flaw of Hooper and Green's 1974 biography was that these men were, quote, perhaps too conscientious, too careful, too respectful to get under Lewis's guard and penetrate his defenses. Asked to elaborate, Muggeridge said he thought there was some mystery in Lewis. Quote, "Something hasn't come out. I think it has to do with his attitude toward women and sex. Some evasion he is hiding from us. I think he was probably a very deeply sensual man, and he fought to put it away from him." Richard Harries, who was Dean of King's College London at the time, took a similar line in a series of talks for the BBC's Radio 4, shortly after the airing of the television version of Shadowlands in 1985. Harries compared Lewis's sensuality to Oscar Wilde and speculated that the authoritarian God he portrayed in his writing and the impatience he at times demonstrated with those who thought differently from him was a result of Lewis's own early emotional experience, the traumatic death of his mother, the extreme instability of his father, and a cruel schoolmaster. Like others, Harries prefaced his critique with, quote, a tribute to how much I have over many years derived from his thinking, unquote, and identified the importance of his topic as lying with Lewis's influence. He remarked, "We all to some extent create God in our own image. With most of us, this does not matter too much. With Lewis, it is a matter of the greatest importance, for he, almost more than anyone else, has been responsible for shaping our understanding of God." Yet, having granted that Lewis had admirable qualities, the sum of Harry's reaction was, as he said, "I never met C.S. Lewis, but I don't think I would have felt at ease with him, nor am I entirely at ease with his God." Like Muggeridge, Carpenter, Wilson, and others, Harries took Lewis seriously, but wondered about the nature of his religion, his emotional life, and his relationships with women, and how these might have affected his life and work. For a number of British writers, Lewis was an uncomfortable figure. Detangling the admirable from the odd, from the reprehensible, was the task before those trying to locate the true Lewis, that is, one scrubbed of sex faults and weaknesses. That said, the British were not immune to romanticized portraits of Lewis's life. In 1985, the London-based Brian Sibley wrote a book about Lewis's marriage to Joy Davidman Gresham, based largely upon American Lyle Dorset's uncritical 1983 biography of Davidman and her relationship with Lewis. The British playwright William Nicholson, that's William Nicholson, then wrote his televised drama turned play turned Hollywood movie Shadowlands based on Sibley's account. Nicholson has said he wanted to portray the emotionally relatable elements of Lewis with Shadowlands and that he saw himself in Lewis's life. Quote, "At the time, I thought I was writing about Joy's cancer, but what happened, as always happens in pieces that go well, you find your own story in the ostensible structure, and a story about a middle-aged man failing out of fear to go all out in loving somebody obviously resonated with me. I was 33 and not in a long-term relationship, pretending this was because I was a writer. But the truth was that I was frightened of love, and I think I spotted that in Lewis, and so I poured my emotions into that story, and it worked because those emotions were true." To bring out the story within the story, Nicholson depicted Lewis as a person whose cerebral bachelor existence at Magdalen was unexpectedly interrupted when he fell in love with the charming American Jewish divorcee. Shadowlands is about an intensely romantic marriage that awakens a professor to emotion and beauty, and then, when joy is lost, plunges him into grief that leads to a crisis of faith. Reality was not so cinematic. A 2015 biography of Joy Davidman clarified the extent to which the development of the Lewis-Gresham relationship differed from stage and screen depictions. When Lewis met Joy, she was Mrs. Gresham, a married mother of two, whose correspondence with Lewis had inspired an obsession with him. Her letters and accounts of those who knew her at the time revealed that she traveled to England expressly to seduce Lewis, intending all the while that in her absence her husband would have an affair with her cousin, living with them at the time to escape an abusive partner, giving her grounds for a divorce. This, in the end, was what happened. Davidman then fed Lewis, according to her biographer, quote, "a myth made of half-truths, exaggerations, omissions, and self-pity," unquote, about the domestic drama she had in large part created, winning his pity and loyalty. So those facts don't do any justice to the real-life relationship between Lewis and Joy, but neither are they good material for a romantic drama. But the point is that Sibley and Nicholson's depictions of a more relatable and marketable Lewis illustrate that Americans weren't the only ones content to create from history a man and a story that better suited their predilections. So, there's been a bit of a transatlantic tug of war, with people in both countries reacting to other people's takes on Lewis's relationship to sex and women. I think that's interesting, insofar that it shows that many have felt that there was something at stake in getting Lewis's personal life right, however that was defined, or rescuing it from other people's tellings. But I'll tell you, after all this study, I still sometimes don't quite understand why people felt these stakes. I understand why they thought Lewis was interesting or important, but I don't fully understand the emotional or meaning-making aspect of it all. Stakes can be believed, but they are mainly felt. They inspire action. They inspire biographies, as we've just seen. By now, in fact, you could argue that they've inspired over 7 decades worth of biographies. So in this final third section, in which I want to pull back and look at biographies of Lewis as a whole and biography as a genre in search for an answer to this question, what is really felt to be at stake here? So we're going to kind of think again. Actually, I'm not going to go. Don't look at that yet. Look at my nice simple outline. So let's think again particularly about Christian historiography. In Making Evangelical History, Faith, Scholarship, and the Evangelical Past, Andrew Atherstone and David Sari Jones say that biographies are good places to look for displays of 2 contested historiographical perspectives among Christians. You have confessional histories, primarily aimed to, quote, to encourage the Christian believer and be an aid to Christian devotion, on the one hand, and professional approaches on the other that, quote, pay particular attention to the social and cultural context of historical events. Biography, they go on, has often been the go-to genre for evangelical authors because biographies are, quote, often the most accessible entry point for many readers into an appreciation of the past. They write, amongst evangelicals, old-style didactic biography remains supremely popular. Okay, so we've got confessional and professional biographies. So let's now take a look at this list with that schema in mind. Okay, so these are the American biographies that I've listed here chronologically. I've put in bold the books I'd say fall into the obviously confessional camp, judging by, for example, how they're advertised on the dust jacket, and I've put a note about the author's profession. You don't have to read this in detail. It's just kind of a impression. That's kind of the general lay of the land. The American, and then that's the British biographies. Okay? So we got American and British. So obviously the American ones are more numerous. And in terms of the confessional versus professional categories, we can see that there are certainly both, though fewer confessional ones in the UK. But looking at this group, the categories of professional, confessional don't strike me as particularly helpful, actually. The obviously confessional biographies here aren't really comparable to the 19th century missionary biographies that I think Atherstone and Jones had in mind when they described confessional biographies as old-style didactic biography. Confessional biographies of Lewis tend to be your picture books, your books aimed at kids, books published in timing with a movie, coffee table books, books clearly intended for readers looking for an emotional connection to Lewis or a feel-good read. The aesthetics alone will tell you that. These authors know that their readers want to remember Lewis as a cheerleader, a model, an inspiring Christian saint, and they cater to them in an obvious way. They tend to be produced by publishers like Crossway, Bethany, Erdman's. The rest of the biographies in this list, at least to some degree, are professional biographies in that they, quote, pay particular attention to the social and cultural context of historical events surrounding Lewis. Few of them have pictures. Now, maybe you'd say, maybe we all want more pictures. Now, maybe you'd say, well, that's obvious. There are different audiences intended for these different kinds of books. That's nothing new, especially with a figure like Lewis, who wrote in different genres and for different kinds of readers. So some are academic treatments and some are coffee table books. Okay, that's true. But what if we didn't take that for granted? What if we suspended what we knew about 20th century book markets for a moment? And if I try to do that, it strikes me that the confessional-professional demarcation, at least as I've applied it, gets muddied by 2 other factors that are shaping what these biographies say, what they look like, and why they exist. So when we walk into a bookstore and take a book off the shelf, we tend to assume that that book exists because an inspired author sat down in an inspiring room to share an inspiring new personal insight. But the reality is that since the 40s, there's always been a market for new Lewis biographies, especially in the States. In other words, we have to consider that there's a motivation for producing a Lewis biography in addition to interest on the part of the author in Lewis, and regardless of whether or not they have something new to say. And as the book market became ever more competitive in the years after Lewis's death, that became even more true, and for publishers at all levels. When I was talking to publishers about my book on Lewis's fame, the editor at Yale University Press wanted to know if I'd be interested in writing a biography. Why? Because Jones and Atherson are right. Biography is a more accessible form of history. Therefore, it sells much better than other kinds. The result of this is that we have to assume that the market has shaped not only the fact that a given book exists, but also how it might be casting Lewis in light of reader expectations. That's what A.N. Wilson was reacting to, in part when he decided to respond to American hagiography with a more realistic or human portrait of Lewis. That was also on display in Hooper and Green's urgency to write an official biography of Lewis in 1974. These biographies represent an ongoing conversation about who gets to shape Lewis's image for an eager public and who gets to reap the social and financial rewards of doing that. The second factor to mention is the relationship of biography itself to other forms of history writing, and in particular to the academic profession of history writing as it took shape in the 20th century. In Biography and History, Barbara Kane takes us through the history of biography since classical times. In the classical world, capital H history was a record of nations, kings and queens, military conquerors, i.e. the stuff you'd need to know if you intended to go into politics or lead armies. That was deemed the more important kind of history. Biography held lesser status than history, but was still important because it was, as she says, one of the major ways in which to commemorate the life of a significant individual and to bring to mind noble characters or to evaluate the deeds and the lives of significant public men. Plutarch's Parallel Lives, Kane goes on, was for, quote, many centuries the most widely read and influential of classical biographies, which paired and contrasted Greek and Roman rulers, military leaders, and philosophers in ways that showed both their strengths and their failings, and allowed the scope for extended oral and philosophical reflections on their motives and conduct, and indeed on the civilizations that they serve to represent. This is Kane. It was Plutarch who emphasized most strongly the difference between biography and history, and who demanded freedoms for the biographer from the rigor that was so central to the writing of history. For the biographer, Plutarch insisted, it was not deeds that mattered so much as character, and the delineation of character often demanded that attention be paid to aspects of the private life or public figures that were not usually deemed significant in the writing of history. Kane goes on, Plutarch refused either to confine himself exclusively to the political or military aspects of a person's life, or to cover the public life of his subjects chronologically and comprehensively. On the contrary, he was deliberately selective, choosing those aspects of each person that he saw as most revealing of his character, accepting that these would not necessarily be the most significant episodes from a historical point of view. That freedom to choose the incidents that reveal character and inclination that Plutarch demanded for biography served further to underline its lower status. A biography might well offer a basis for private contemplation and therefore serve a moral purpose, but its stress on the individual and its concern with the private realm and with daily life meant that for many centuries it was regarded as a lower and less important form of writing history than history. Okay, we're getting there. Okay, so biography was for many centuries read by those who wanted to think seriously about morals, character, and otherwise weigh the pros and cons of an individual and their choices. But it was also considered second best. Fast forward to the 20th century, and biography continued to be seen as a lower tier of history writing till about the 70s. Well, maybe a little earlier than that, but 70s is when biography really began to be used more often as a way to understand larger trends and social issues. Individual lives began to be seen as windows onto big H history. Now, many Lewis biographers have been professors. They've been they're in this room. They've been literary scholars, philosophers, theologians, and political theorists. Many of them were Christians working in university settings. They intended their biographies of Lewis to be a credit to their careers as professors and scholars. And because of that, they needed to follow the conventions and norms of academic writing, which means writing professional biographies. But here's the thing. I know from years spent looking at Lewis's reception that Christians, and white American university-educated Christians in particular, are not, as a group, taken with Lewis in some disinterested way. Right? When we speak in less prescriptive or less formal or less academic settings, such as interviews or blogs or podcasts or letters or reviews or at conferences like this or from the pulpit, we can see, to oversimplify and put it crudely, that many are interested in Lewis in the Plutarch way, as a model for their own lives. Most, I'd say, whether university professors or not, are interested in his person and life as an example for what they want to be, as Christians working in university settings typically. They are interested in his character. But today there isn't really a middle ground, like what Plutarch extolled for biography. Arguably, academic norms and conventions have prevented some of these people from being more explicit about their interest in Lewis. Then again, we're all swimming in the same water, so it's difficult to imagine what a character biography of Lewis would look like if it didn't read like missionary biographies of the 19th century, and it didn't look like a coffee table book either. All the same, I think that a book like Alistair McGrath's 2013 biography is a result of this situation. Professor McGrath has quoted Lewis regularly in his speeches and writings for many years. He certainly moves in evangelical circles, including American ones, and his biography was published by Tyndale, a Christian publisher, with the help of a literary agency that specializes in evangelical publishing. I think it's safe to say that American Christians were expected to be the most significant audience for that biography. Many of his readers would be looking to learn something new about Lewis, which is why the book was heavily marketed as having corrected the year of Lewis's conversion by something like 2 years. Yet McGrath writes that his purpose was, quote, not to praise Lewis or condemn him, but to understand him. Above all, his ideas and how these found expression in his writings. McGrath has written a respectable biography by 20th century academic convention, but it is meant for an audience that I have to think, based on my work on Lewis's fans, craves something out of Lewis that yet another recitation of the events of his life or yet another summary of his philosophy won't give. So maybe it's understandable that I'm confused about what's really at stake when people talk about Lewis's life. Or maybe all of this is too much. Let's get back to a comforting, superficial read on it, shall we? Let's move from the bookish Christian crowd over to the mob, the anonymous mob. Maybe for many people, the nitty-gritty of Lewis's life is actually more akin to Entertainment Weekly reading. And look, fair enough. It's natural to be curious. We're interested in famous people's sex lives and in interesting people's sex lives, and especially when they are, as in Lewis's case, messy or complicated. And Lewis himself left enough behind in letters, diaries, published writings to make for fun speculation. He wrote about love, he wrote about gender, he wrote about sex, the archetype of maleness, the archetype of femaleness. He tried to create order out of the loss of his wife, to create imagery evoking male and female, to do a little parsing of the different expressions of love. He was interested himself in these questions. Some of the papers of this conference will shed some light on Lewis's views on such topics. A number of people in this room already have. So I'll just give a couple of closing thoughts to wrap up. The first is that at the end of the day, I need some water. It's the end of the day. At the end of the day, I'm left thinking that the history of Lewis in America suggests that we as a culture don't yet have very helpful ways of understanding and talking about the role that sex as a life force plays in our lives generally, but especially in the role it plays in the creative process and creative persons. Maybe if we did, we would get a little further in our conversations about it. I want to know why some of the most highly emotional, highly creative people often have colorful sex lives. Hemingway, Picasso, Warhol, John Galliano, Mick Jagger, Woody Allen, to take some examples from the 20th century. Why do men come to mind? Those guys were kind of awe-inspiring in their appetites as they produced some of the 20th century's most influential works of art. I'm interested in their sex lives just as much as the next person. But why? Why do I care if Woody Allen is a creep or Hemingway was a womanizer? I think it makes sense intuitively that there is a connection between our exploration of meaning through sex and relationships on the one hand and seeking truth through art on the other. But if so, I haven't found great sources for understanding what that relationship is, though I'm sure I haven't looked very hard. I don't even know if it's a philosophical, anthropological, or psychological explanation I'm looking for. C.S. Lewis in America raises a historiographical question for me. How do we put the more nebulous forces at work in us more squarely at the center of the story? Our sexism, our fascination with sex, our need for saints, our need for other people's lives to be either neater or more of a disaster than our own, our intolerance for nuance and complexity. How do we put those impulses more at the center of our histories? And shouldn't we, if they are as powerful as the human race has long suspected them to be? Thank you.
Hi there, Brian Ballard here.
Hi.
I'm thinking about this, the big picture argument. You're trying to explain a difference in how Lewis is received here versus across the pond. And so like for this, I'm wondering if there's a gap in the argument here. Like for this argument to work, you're going to need to locate like an explanatory factor that's more salient here proportionately to the difference we find. So like you identified like this rugged masculinity and this misogyny piece. And so that might be present among the evangelical culture that you're talking about. But for that to explain the difference, it would have to be the case that it's proportionately absent in the English culture you're talking about.
No, I'm not saying that's the main factor. I'm saying that's one factor that I didn't emphasize enough in my book, which tackles a lot more in terms of the explanation. So
sure. Okay, so for that even to be a factor, though, you're going to have some kind of difference. If that is just held fixed between the two cultures, that's not explaining any difference because it would just be the same. So I was just wondering if that's really, it seems like that's a piece I want to hear more about. You know, like certainly when I think of great English philosophers of the 20th century, even the late 20th century, they're very ruggedly masculine and confident and brash, much like Lewis himself, I suppose. So I wondered why we should think that difference actually holds in the way that you would need it to, for that even to be a factor that explains the difference.
I mean, if you don't, you can think it's not a factor. I think it's a factor. I mean, I think Dumay's book kind of convinced me that it was a factor, that like these ideals of masculinity among the American evangelical cohort, that was a really like a through line of evangelical identity, and evangelicals in America were some of the most ardent fans of Lewis. So that's my logic. It seems to map very well on it to me. I mean, this isn't a whole paper on that. I'm sure please, somebody else write a book about it. I don't know. There's plenty more that could be said. I'm not saying it's a watertight argument. It's my observation.
Thank you, Dr. Derrick, for your talk. My name is Josh Herring. I found this really interesting. I'm also personally kind of terrified by the creativity of your Aslan behind you. I want to ask, similar to the last question, I want to ask, I want to raise a possibility of a counter argument, just primarily to hear your response. I'm really intrigued by sociologist Philip Yancey's argument that Christianity is currently in the middle of about 120 year process of splitting into two different religions between, he talks about biblical Christianity and progressive Christianity. And he argues that those are diverging to the point that they actually are two separate strands of belief. And I've heard it said several times when I was in seminary that England in particular and Europe in general tended to be 20 to 30 years ahead of American Christianity in terms of pursuing liberal theology in different veins. So I'm curious so I say all that to ask, is it possible as a counter explanation for what you're describing that Lewis the traditionalist resonates with a much more conservative American Christianity where his English base has really, most of them are nowhere near as conservative in their theology as the typical American reader? So I'd love to hear any thoughts you have about that as an additional nuance to your argument.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of where I landed 10 years ago, was that these, that's why I kind of mentioned the sense of engagement that Christians in the UK tend to prioritize engagement in society. And that's a difference in America, but America is just so big and there's so many split offs. So I'm not sure if just thinking about Yancey's differential there. I don't know if I'd agree with just a 1-2 progressive and biblical, but anyway, yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I think that's kind of where I landed 10 years ago, and
Well, thank you. So I was interested. I'm a literary biographer, so I'm interested in your data. So I was interested in a point you made earlier in the talk, that you said that American audiences were attracted to Lewis's masculinity, his brash attitudes. Am I accurately stating that?
yes, that I can't prove it, but I think
but
yeah.
No, but that's what they're attracted to. So what I'm wondering is, in the 1940s to the 1960s, what's the material on which American audiences were basing that? Because you quoted a number of people who knew him, but those are people who were in England. This is not a time of, he didn't do television interviews, he didn't do radio interviews. So what is the evidence? How would American audiences get a sense of that sense of masculinity?
Well, I said to the extent that it was known.
But to what extent is it known to them? Or was it known at that time?
Well, it wasn't as known, and then the biographies, yes, came out later. You're exactly right. Biographies came out later. We knew more in the 80s, especially then. But there's the Lancelin and Green was 74. We could go back to the biography list. I mean, I would say I was mapping onto Dumas's argument, and she was saying that evangelicals especially, but I think it goes further than I think she spoke also to American Christianity, but that the masculinity, the identifying around kind of these values of kind of great men and great strong men, that became a touching point as the evangelical movement kind of coalesced into a more coherent one in the 70s, 80s onward. So, I mean, sure, we could talk about like what point in time and where, but I mean, you've got Chad Walsh's 49 biography, but I don't think you have to also kind of pair that with how well he's known generally and how much he's read and how at the depth that he's read. So it's a kind of a complicated kind of situation in terms of who knows what at what time and how much masculinity played into that. I mean, I think really 90s, if you look at the article, like the graph of hits on articles about Lewis, it spikes in the 90s. And so by the 90s, we'd had all of these, as Dr. Johnson said, like these wars about Lewis. So a lot more was known in the 90s. And then in the 70s and 80s, the Lewis scholars were kind of digging in and deciding what to reveal and what not to, and they were having discussions, and then they're producing material, and I think maybe a greater public was more aware of these things. But then again, I mean, I could go back and forth. In the 40s, that 1947 cover of Lewis on Time magazine, he was described there as like kind of I don't remember, but it was like there was a brashness to it. There was always in the public view of Lewis, like the way that he presented or the media presented him was always the underdog at Oxford. He's the Christian underdog at Oxford. And I think that there was like some kind of a brashness to that. But again, I'm talking about a very amorphous phenomenon.
Got time for one last question.
Hi. It seems to me one part of Lewis's kind of anti-modern persona, which wouldn't map neatly onto kind of American fundamentalist deification of him, is how seriously he takes paganism and how he kind of makes room for a theology that absorbs paganism as opposed to kind of standing in contrast to it. And I wondered if that was something that those who, did the deifying had to de-emphasize.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there was a lot to de-emphasize and a lot to re-emphasize. I mean, you all know in this room, his corpus is huge and so nuanced and beautiful, and we can all appreciate like the soul behind it and the sensitivity behind it. And so, yeah, I mean, that's kind of what's interesting is like what is emphasized or de-emphasized theologically, literary, personality. And I think what's interesting about that is to me is that it reveals to me that that's in our human nature to pick, choose, mold. So there was a lot of that with Lewis and he's a great way of looking at this way of our tendency, because there's so many people who have talked about it for so long. And I think that's a great point, but sure.
Thank you, Dr. Derrick, for your lecture and for all the questions.